legado desses 4 anos é que a gente incrivelmente conseguiu mais do que a gente imaginava.
Poder abrir suas portas para um público diverso
que leva em consideração o contato com o público
e poder criar a sua programação com eles.
Que eles possam sair com um sentimento de pertencimento,
de aproximação, de criação de afeto.
O foco da governança do Museu do Amanhã e do IDG está em entregar para o nosso público o melhor produto possível.
O Museu do Amanhã recebeu hoje em Londres o Leading Culture Destinations Award.
Considerado simplesmente o Oscar dos museus.
Porque a atividade fim do museu é pessoas.
É isso que nós queremos oferecer para cada um dos visitantes que vem aqui conhecer o Museu do Amanhã.
Olá a todos, bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao Museu do Amanhã. Continuamos com nossa programação digital, entrevistando grandes personalidades, pensadores, artistas e pessoas que fazem a diferença com sua pesquisa, sua ação, sua arte. Hoje temos a honra de conversar com o biólogo estadunidense Thomas Lovejoy. Mr. Lovejoy, thank you for having this conversation with us. I have seen your lecture, so it's definitely an honor to talk to you.
Prazer, minha.
Um biólogo inovador, Thomas ganhou fama internacional quando, em 1980, cunhou o termo diversidade biológica. Lovejoy é ambientalista, biólogo, doutor pela Universidade de Yale, nos Estados Unidos, membro sênior da Fundação das Nações Unidas e professor de ciências ambientais na Universidade George Mason. Escreveu mais de 250 artigos científicos e publicou muitos livros ao longo de sua carreira. Na década de 80, ele chamou a atenção internacional para a conservação das florestas tropicais do mundo, em particular para a Amazônia brasileira, onde trabalha desde 1965. Hoje, depois de ganhar vários prêmios por suas realizações acadêmicas e ambientais, Thomas fala sobre a relação entre a pandemia do novo coronavírus e o uso indevido dos recursos naturais, e sobre como podemos diminuir os impactos das mudanças climáticas nos ecossistemas e, por fim, em nós mesmos. Mr. Lovejoy, we live in a strange and also unique times. While many researchers say that the cause of the 2020 pandemic relates to human activities abuses in the use of biodiversity resources and illegal wildlife trading, we might be the generation who is witnessing the last moments of possible action to demise worst-case scenarios due to climate emergency. After many waves of fake news in the last years, it seems that there is a renewed public interest in the scientific discourse. Do you think that scientific narrative has changed during this pandemic?
So I think it's actually had a beneficial effect. One doesn't think about pandemics as having beneficial effects. But there has actually been more than one. And one of them is an increased awareness and concern about what science brings to understanding the issue and how to deal with it. It is dogged on a daily basis by a lot of fake news and social media, the motivation of which is very hard for me to understand. And one has to be smart in sort of sorting out, what is reliable media, what is reliable news, and what is questionable.
Yeah, sure. In that sense, we have to raise the critical sense of the audience for them to grasp what's true from what is false in that sense. You have been the environmental advisor to former US presidents such as Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, and a former World Bank chief advisor for biodiversity. In the last years, we have seen the rise of populism movements in many countries. How do you see the position of political leaders who deny science, such as Presidents Donald Trump and Brazilian Jair Bolsonaro?
So, I think in the end, they will not go down well in history because of that. But in the interim, they create waves that get in the way of actually devising the proper solutions and the proper ways forward. And so one of the other advantages of this pandemic is it actually gives the world a chance essentially to reset the development trajectory, which has been creating all kinds of problems, as we know, around biodiversity and climate change and increasing the probability of pandemics. So it's really created a lot of chaos, but in the process created important opportunity we would be smart to take advantage of.
Sure. And I think that in that sense, the left-wing parties, which are normally the ones that discuss more about environmental issues, they are reviewing their agenda, especially in Europe and also here in Brazil, their development agenda. In Europe, most left parties are doing coalitions with green parties. Nevertheless, why do you think the environmental political discourse has difficulties to leave behind the superficial discussions and go towards a more active engagement of the population? What they can do to change?
So, everybody can participate in this change. It's not that people are totally helpless in the face of all these things. And so it basically comes down to the recipe for being, a sound citizen, which is educate yourself. And that doesn't matter whether you're left, right, or center, right? Educate yourself what the science says, and then figure out practical ways forward.
Mm-hmm. There are thinkers such as the French anthropologist and philosopher Bruno Latour, who also gave us an interview, who suggests that we are exactly in the same position as when Europeans discovered the New World and when cartographers had to redraw their maps. 4 centuries later, there is a new Earth to rediscover, one that is reacting to our actions, for which we need new descriptions, new visualizations. How would you describe this Earth in transition that we are living right now?
So I think, this incredibly important moment, if it is taken advantage of in the right kind of way, will be a moment of transformation in which the majority of the human population come to realize that we need nature, that the planet works as a linked biological and physical system, and that it is in our direct interest to manage it in a sustainable way. And that means, avoiding much of the potential climate change that we've already set in motion, and there are ways to do that. And also essentially taking care of the extraordinary variety of biological resources that this planet is endowed with, and which can directly benefit our future.
Sure.
And I'll just jump in here with an example. So if you ask the average person, what good is a virus? they wouldn't have a clue. They would think that there's nothing good about a virus. Well, in fact, if you go back and study the history of the concept of vaccination, which essentially has improved the lives of billions of people since it was discovered, that actually came because of a very smart research MD observing the action of a virus before it was even known that it was a virus. So Edward Jenner actually noticed that the women who milked cows in UK got a disease called cowpox, and that they did not get the much deadlier disease of smallpox. And he actually did an experiment and created the opportunity for them to get sick with smallpox, and it protected them. And so the whole concept of vaccination came from a virus. And, you know, I don't know any economist who's ever tried to calculate what that benefit probably has meant over the couple centuries it's existed. But it is a staggering number. So the biological diversity of the planet is full of potential insights into biological systems and solutions to particular problems that can bring all kinds of benefit to the human condition.
Sure. We say that is one of those base nature solutions. And I think that's all sort of biodiversities. They give us a chance to reconsider our role in this planet as well, and to take care of ecosystems and ourselves in the end.
So one of the really important ways to think about biodiversity beyond the services it provides and the immediate benefits we get from particular species is that it is in fact a gigantic living library for the life sciences. And every species on Earth every day is inventing new solutions to the biological challenges in its existence. And any one of those at any moment can transform how we think about the life sciences and benefit us in very practical ways.
Sure. Regarding wildlife trading, you said recently that the aim should be reducing certain amounts of wildlife animals in markets, so the probability of viruses leaping from wild animals to farmed animals in markets becomes small enough that is inconsequential. The big difficulty is that if we just shut the markets down, which in many ways would be the ideal thing, they would be topped up by black markets. And that's even harder to deal because they are clandestine. How to regulate wildlife trades around the world in post-pandemic times, and what would be the first steps to do that?
Well, I completely agree. If you try and shut it down, it will simply pop up elsewhere in some illegal form. But what it does need to do is be very seriously regulated and subject to the rule of law, and managed in ways that reduces the probability of contact with human beings and a leap from those animals of some pathogen to create another pandemic. You know, and those things happen every year. You know, they usually, you know, are happily contained one way or another, so the public is not aware of it. And back in the 60s, when I was doing my PhD in the Amazon studying birds, I also was studying the viruses, the arthropod-borne viruses those birds were carrying. I had my office at the Instituto Evandro Chagas in Belém. on it. And what you understand when you do those kinds of studies is it is natural for natural systems to have these pathogens cycling through. And what we need to be really careful about is not disturbing the environment in ways that increases the probability that one of them will spill over into human populations. So it's both a matter of how we manage the natural world and how we manage the wildlife markets.
Sure. And I'm sure that China didn't like that much when they had to shut down the markets and see the impacts that it had on their economy due to this pandemic. So hopefully, I think that many countries will have to regulate them in order to keep us healthy in that sense.
Yeah, and it's not just Southeast Asia. It's, you know, it's the bushmeat trade in Africa, and there is animal trade and things like that that go on in the Americas as well.
Yeah.
I mean, much better than it actually was when I was first in the Amazon. Basically, there was very little control on wildlife markets. And you just go down to the market in Beileng and you could buy, you know, wild animals. That's much more controlled today.
Yeah. Even here in Rio de Janeiro, when you go to the suburbs, sometimes you find markets that sell wildlife animals, and hopefully they will be regulated from now on for our sake as well. Well, Carlos Nobre, an important Brazilian climatologist who you have worked with recently, said this year that the Amazon region might see the rise of a new epidemic due to its deforestation development model over the next years or decades. How do you think politicians can become more aware regarding the possible outcomes of Amazon deforestation in recent years?
So, you know, as we were touching on, new pathogens emerge almost annually and more frequently on a global basis in recent decades. And that's just a measure of human intrusion into nature. So, and then, you know, I mean, think about all those pathogens circulating through the Amazon biodiversity, for example, and then blowing unbelievable amounts of change through those ecosystems through climate change. It is inevitable that sooner or later that will increase the probability of a new pathogen arising. So basically, the message that COVID-19 has actually sent us is, let's back off, respect nature, respect and take advantage of the knowledge about the life sciences we can gain from it, and protect ourselves simultaneously from these bad consequences.
And I think that when we look into the traditional communities who have lived in the forest for thousands and thousands of years, we see that the indigenous communities' ancestral wisdom comprehends that humans are not separate from nature, that we live in constant exchange with the environment that surrounds us, and that we depend on them to survive. In your travels in the Amazon region, did you happen to hear reports of climate change from traditional communities, and why, and what were these observations like, and what they can teach us about our relationship with ecosystems?
So, you know, the indigenous peoples are just amazingly in tune to the natural systems and biodiversity with which they live. And they notice when there's change. They inevitably, that wasn't like it used to be. Or, you know, here in the Southeast Amazon, the dry season seems to be a lot longer than it used to be. Right? So in many ways, they are the first ones to pick it up, and they don't even need to actually be measuring it the way the scientists do.
Yes.
But they're also more dependent on it. So they have a very serious vested interest in trying to keep it in some kind of equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Well, the new coronavirus has reached the Amazon indigenous communities, unfortunately. What do you think might be the outcomes for them and the forests until they have access to a vaccine?
Well, the impact already of the COVID-19 on indigenous peoples in the Amazon is quite frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And my old friend Chief Paya Khan, who I knew back from the late 1980s and early 1990s, has died as a consequence. And others have preferred actually not to go to Western type hospitals for treatment. So they're just much more vulnerable to these kinds of things. And that's why there was such a drop in indigenous population soon after the arrival of Europeans. Sometimes that was intentional. I would imagine a lot of the time it was unintentional. But they are very, very vulnerable. And so it's, from a humanitarian point of view, it is incredibly important to give them the best medical protection possible. Mm-hmm. Protection number one is just keep people away until this has died down. Mm-hmm. But if it's already reached there, then they need some really good medical treatment, and maybe even some of them should go to hospitals in cities if the cities are not overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Since you mentioned cities, recently you said that sustainable cities that provide quality of life could be part of the solution for the conservation of the Amazon. You use, for example, the governor of Amazonas state, Wilson Lima, understands that the free tax zone of Manaus is what makes the forest coverage possible in the largest state in Brazil. What major role can cities close to the large forests play in biodiversity conservation?
So the trick of a sustainable city in the Amazon, beyond the standard basic quality of life one needs to have in any city in terms of energy and adequate sanitation and the rest, is to actually have economic livelihoods be ones that depend on the forest in a positive way, do not do destructive things to the forest. And there's a fair variety of things that can be done. I mean, in the case of Manaus, most of the industry is built around assembly, and the things that are assembled don't use resources from the forest. So there is some impact on the forest in terms of food supply, but in the end, the huge promise of the Amazon is in all that biological diversity. And Carlos has talked about the need for something like an MIT for the Amazon. Yes. It actually probably should be something like the National Institute for Amazon Research, INPA, in Manaus, but with considerably more in the way of resources, and partnering with industry to bring those things to scale. So some of it is like very straightforward. It's like aquaculture, amazing fish that live in the Amazon system. And that's already happening to some degree in Acre and scattered other places. But what it really needs to do is be brought to scale in a very sustainable way and become a major export market for the world, so that tambaqui will become as well known as salmon or cod. And there's no reason it can't, because it's so good, right?
Yes.
But in the end, the huge promise of the Amazon is in all that biodiversity that really hasn't been explored very much yet. And everybody always thinks about medicines, and of course there are medicines involved in some of these plants and other organisms in the Amazon. But trying to develop medicines is a long and complex and costly process. So it cannot be the main sort of economic horse that we hitch this wagon to. But if you start exploring further for natural fungicides and things like that, in a world where the pesticides, the human created pesticides that we have are creating all kinds of really terrible problems. The Amazon is full of solutions to replace those with essentially sustainable products. So that very biodiversity, which is so daunting, is in the end the resource which will give the Amazon the kind of economic future it needs. And one of the really puzzling things is why ecotourism is so poorly developed in the Amazon. There's absolutely no reason it can't become a major ecotourism destination.
Sure.
The way little Costa Rica has done. I can't give you the percentage of the gross national product of Costa Rica that comes from ecotourism, but it's a substantial number. And only recently has it been surpassed by the national income from medical devices, which is one of the things you can do in tropical forest cities when you have a well-educated population. So thinking about things that can go on in cities that take advantage of the forest and don't impact the forest is the way forward.
Yeah, and hopefully for the next years might see a rise in the ecotourism, because people might see it as a safer place to go instead of cities. So hopefully, if they get organized in a way that it can grow in a sustainable way with lower impacts, that might be a way.
Yeah, it needs to be done both sustainably, but also there's actually a need for an ecotourism guide school.
Yes.
That we've thought about, my colleagues in Manaus. And we are looking at a possibility right now that could create a place to actually do that. And think about Manaus, everybody loves to go check out the Opera House, which is so improbable.
Yeah.
There is no reason that Manaus could not have a world-class aquarium that becomes as famous as a symbol of Manaus as the Opera House. And there are 3,000 species of fish in the Amazon, right? More than any other river system in the world. So it's a matter of trying to think out of the box, but in a very sustainable framework.
Sure, those are nice ideas to grasp on, and hopefully we'll see them, some of them, emerging. There was a study presented at the Synod for the Amazon in the Vatican recently, showed that about 70% of South America's gross domestic product derives from the area of influence of rain produced by the Amazon forest. The water vapor carried by the winds of the Amazon is crucial for the water supply of southeastern South America and the Prata River Basin. However, how can the forest endure deforestation so that it does not become a tropical savanna?
So, it is an incredibly interesting and incredibly important question. So I actually knew Aeneas Salati, who was the Brazilian scientist who showed that there was a hydrological cycle in the mid-1970s. And we know a lot more about it now. We know that it benefits every country in South America except Chile, because the moisture doesn't get over the Andes. So it's part of the continental climate system. And some of us, like Carlos Nobre and myself, have worried for a long time about how much deforestation would it take for that cycle to degrade. Mm-hmm. Because what drives the cycle is transpiration through leaves and evaporation off the complex surfaces of the forest. And if there's no forest there, most of that moisture just runs off and is not there to be recycled. And we now have a situation where there is a negative synergy between deforestation, climate change, and extensive use of fire, such as caught the world attention last August. And so Carlos and I are quite concerned that the tipping point is pretty much at hand, at which there would be insufficient moisture to actually have rainforests in the southern and eastern Amazon. And we're seeing longer dry seasons. We're seeing every 5 years or so historically unprecedented droughts. And so it's really right at hand, and each new increment of deforestation is pushing that tipping point further. Well, the good news is we know what the solution is, which is reforestation, controlling deforestation and promoting reforestation. It's all about trees and leaves. And so it's quite possible to build back the margin of safety and protect that hydrological cycle. And that has to be done at the same time as thinking about sustainable livelihoods for the people who live in the Amazon in terms of the hydrological cycle and the forest context.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you mentioned, if we already lost 20% of the Brazilian Amazon, what are the benefits for regenerating the forest by planting native trees?
So the benefits to begin with are actually securing the hydrological cycle and the continental climate system. But all that biodiversity involved in reforestation has its promise as well. And it's not as if every bit of the revegetation has to be classic reforestation of the natural ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Some of it could involve some agroforestry, including some commercially important tree species in the mix. But we really have got to get to the point where we are building back the margin of safety. And so Carlos and I have suggested, that for each new increment of deforestation, it would be wise to match it with 3 times as much reforestation. Why 3 times as much? Maybe it should be even more, but it's because when you start reforestation, you don't have much in the way of a forest to actually be producing moisture for the hydrological cycle. So you're trying to balance that equation. And I think the other nations of the Amazon, have a vested interest in successful management of the hydrological cycle. I think the world, in fact, would be willing to make contributions financially and technically. It's done it before. I think it can do it again. It is no small task, and as important as it is nationally for Brazil and the other countries, it's also incredibly important for the global carbon cycle. And so I think a joint effort is in fact a reasonable outcome.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you mentioned it, how do you think that developed countries could contribute to regenerate biodiversity and empower local forest communities and the Amazon biome as a whole?
So, they've done it before. When the G7 met in 1990 in Houston, they discussed the then very large problem with the Brazilian rainforests and came up with a multi-billion-dollar program they funded through the World Bank for the Brazilian rainforests. Very successful program, but it was a pilot program. And of course, we had the Amazon Fund that Norway and Germany and others contributed to. So even though the world is probably quite challenged right now economically, I think you could see the beginnings of a group effort to assist in all of this.
Nice. Well, you said in an article for a Brazilian magazine that the fires that produced the ash smoke that hit São Paulo in August last year were something like a senseless burning of books of those made by 20th century dictators. It was an act that eliminated species from biodiversity, the vast majority of which are still unknown to science. Some scientists are saying that we have already ignited the 6th mass extinction, that half of the Earth's habitats and animals shall disappear until the next century. Which consequences we might see still in this century regarding mass extinction?
So although some scientists like to debate whether the 6th extinction has really started or not, I think it's pretty clear that it has, but that doesn't mean that it has to progress. So essentially the same kinds of solutions that we were talking about for protecting the hydrological cycle are ways to avoid that 6th major extinction really getting vigorously underway. And it's a matter of actually looking at the natural world as a hugely positive part of human existence. Mm-hmm. It is, in fact, an essential way to deal with climate change because there is so much excess CO2 in the atmosphere that it will take us way beyond 1.5 degrees, beyond which the planet is probably biologically unmanageable because ecosystems tend to come apart. And the good news is that reforestation and restoration of other kinds of ecosystems around the planet could bring about 1/3 of the carbon that destroyed nature has put up in the atmosphere back and give us the soft landing we need. So it's time to actually embrace the living planet on which we live and treat it with the respect that it deserves.
Sure. And since we're talking about the future, of course, there is in social media some talks about the environmental benefits from the social isolation that part of humanity is still facing, such as air pollution. Over the lessons learned, do you think the pandemic could be seen as a rehearsal for coordinated efforts necessary for fighting climate change? In that sense, what are we willing to sustain or to abandon as a society in order to react upon the upcoming climate emergency?
Well, that is the benefit, in a way, the major benefit of the pandemic is it gives us a chance to actually design a more sustainable trajectory for the global economy, and one that's much more respectful of the natural world, one that embraces the opportunity that the natural world actually provides us for human benefit and economic benefit. And so I think, the important thing here is to look at this as an important opportunity to actually have a reset button as to how we design the economy going forward. And it's not that we can't have, a vibrant economy. It's that we need one that is truly sustainable. Is not creating all the kinds of waste problems and climate problems, etc.
Yeah, in that sense, let's not go back to the old normal, because I think that we need to rethink as a society the way that we are developing ourselves and to see the limits also that nature has in order for it to regenerate.
Yeah, so I think one of the less appealing aspects of being the social primate that we are is we tend to focus on each other. As I like to say, mutually grooming while the environmental lion sneaks up, right? And the answer actually is very simple, and it's right in front of us, which is just go out and embrace nature, learn about nature, try and figure out ways that nature is part of the solution as opposed to something that needs to be destroyed.
Sure. You have been talking about a lot about aquaculture and all different aspects that the market can embrace in order to make sustainable development possible. You also said about the leaf cutter ants, the way that they avoid some trees in order for us to study those trees as natural pesticides. Could you explain a little bit more about those examples and how they can inspire new generations to come up with solutions that regenerate biodiversity, keep and conserve it?
So let me back up just a little bit. This must have been at least 15 years ago, maybe more, when Paulo Tarso Flecha de Lima was ambassador in Washington. And he and I flew up one day to Connecticut to visit the Pfizer research laboratories, which then was a $3 billion a year operation. And the head of the laboratories was somebody who I actually knew. And he said he thought if you could put an ecological screen on essentially natural extracts that come in for testing, you could have a much higher success rate. And so that led me to think of leafcutter ants and how they're actually taking all those bits of leaves down to be mulch for their underground fungus farm. So by definition, they're avoiding any trees that have natural fungicides in them. So they are basically, if you follow them, they're basically saying, well, I wouldn't touch that tree because it's probably got natural fungicides in it. And then, you know, that gives a clue to the scientists, here's a good one to test. So the more we have knowledge about how the forest works, the easier it will be to find more useful products that nature has already created.
Sure. Overall, it seems that you propose a major change in the way of living and being in the world. So how do we start, even with our social inequality? What are your suggestions?
So I think there are a number of pieces to it. One is that basically everybody should get much better education about the natural world. And all the adults who are around should be given some opportunities to learn about it, so that it can be sort of a transformative moment in terms of human attitudes about nature. But we're not going to solve this problem if it's only an exercise conducted by the elite. And one of the really interesting things in Costa Rica, a biologist named Dan Jansen actually created a whole category of essentially scientific field workers called parataxonomists. And, you know, as you go around the world, you find that there, in fact, are people who are quite knowledgeable about nature. So they don't have fancy degrees or anything, but they know the natural world. We actually have some of them who work for us in my Forest Fragments project north of Manaus. And if somebody who's visiting says to me, well, what is that tree? The odds are I can't answer it. Because there are hundreds and hundreds of species of trees. But one of these people with modest education, but a very fine mind, can actually do that. So I think there needs to be much greater respect for knowledge of nature. And, you know, I'd love to see a time in which, you know, every school in every Amazon country not only has an updated version of the wonderful National Geographic map of the Amazon that came out in 2015, but also a lesson plan that goes with it that explores all of this, so that everybody actually understands the promise, as opposed to thinking of the rainforest as something that gets in the way.
Yes. We were doing a research last year for an exhibition about the Amazon that we are developing for the museum. And it doesn't matter the scientists that we talk in Manaus, at IMPA, at Santarém, at Belém, many of them said that when they go into the fields, when they talk to the indigenous people, when they talk to the traditional communities, it's as if a library, a living library, opens up in front of them. How do you see this possible merge between the, let's say, the pragmatic scientific discourse that normally universities and research centers do, but how can it blend itself with the knowledgeable traditional practices that we see from people that live within the forest, and how that can benefit everybody in the program?
So it actually happens pretty easily. Happens at IMPA, you know, it happens at the University of Amazonas. Happens when people are out in the Forest Fragments project. The more important issue is how you can scale that up and apply it in ways that produce economic return from the living forest as opposed to the destroyed forest.
Thank you. So, Mr. Lovejoy, we are coming closer to the end of our conversation. I would like to ask you to do your final considerations, but also to give you a last question. What would be your message to youngsters that are now at home and that might come up with innovative ways to associate developments and biodiversity regeneration?
So my suggestion is this is actually a moment of tremendous opportunity, where there's a place for a lot of creativity that may be even easier in this situation than it is in a formal classroom. And that the more they explore virtually the knowledge that's out there about biodiversity and the Amazon and how the planet works, the more likely they are going to be to come up with some really important new insights, not only about nature itself, but also very practical ways going forward. My point is, you can do a lot without the formality of a classroom. And in this moment when everybody is sort of confined to the cyber world as the way to connect with the larger world, is a time of great opportunity.
Let's hope for that. Mr. Lovejoy, thank you again for your time. Your work has continuously oriented new perspectives for life sciences and broadened our view of the world's biodiversity and its dynamics in relations with nowadays society. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about biodiversity and the Amazon and tomorrow.
Let's do it together. E muito obrigado também a vocês que nos acompanharam nessa jornada pelo pensamento de um dos maiores ambientalistas da atualidade. Nossa programação tem muitas novidades pela frente. O Museu da Manhã é um equipamento cultural da Secretaria Municipal de Cultura da cidade do Rio de Janeiro, gerido pelo Instituto de Desenvolvimento e Gestão, o IDG. Todos os nossos projetos, programações e atividades só são possíveis por conta da nossa forte rede de apoiadores, patrocinadores e parceiros, como Banco Santander, Shell, IBM, Engie, Lojas Americanas, Grupo Globo e Fundação Roberto Marinho. A gente agradece a todos eles, mas principalmente a vocês que nos assistem. Obrigado. Thank you, Mr. Lovejoy.
Ciao.
Ciao.